Hello and welcome to episode 10 from the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I will be presenting the work of the Canadian writer Marshall McLuhan with reference to chapter 10 in Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy, written by Joost van Loon. Joost's chapter in the book is titled McLuhan and His Influences. Let's start with the introduction on page 161. Whereas Krauss, Tönnies, and the Frankfurt School have provided the first sustained radical critiques of mass media, this was primarily focused on the consequences of media as representational apparatuses. That is to say, the emphasis was on the organisation and practices of media production. The work of the Canadian scholar Marshall McLuhan, however, introduced a rather different type of critique to the analysis of media. His media innovation was based on the insistence of understanding media as technology, rather than representation. And his primary concern was with the way in which the specific technological nature of different media affects the reconstruction of the relationship between human beings and their environment. This is also why the school associated with McLuhan, or McLuhanism, is referred to as media ecology. And the author goes on to state, Marshall McLuhan was a highly controversial figure, both inside and outside the academic world. During his heyday in the 1960s, he was considered a guru, a prophet, the founder of a new calling for socio-cultural theory. In the 1970s, he would lose that acclaim as more and more of his imaginative and visionary ideas were discredited. However, as it has become more and more clear that McLuhan's prophetic thoughts on the role of information and its global impact are more adequate now than ever before, it may not be such a bad idea to return to some of his works and reinstate some of its theoretical force. Marshall McLuhan was born in 1911 in Edmonton, Canada, 3 years before World War I, which his fellow Canadian scholar Harold Innis had fought in. Like Harold Innis, Marshall McLuhan came from a religious background, but unlike Innis, McLuhan's was mixed. His mother was a Baptist teacher and his father was a Methodist practitioner. This type of religious background was unusual considering the difference between Baptists and Methodists. As I discussed in episode 9 on Innis, Baptists have a decentralized structure. Methodists, on the other hand, have a hierarchical structure. Whilst they preach social justice and free will, they place less emphasis on individualism. So, let me pose a question. Which of the two denominations impacted the greatest on Marshall McLuhan? Or did both denominations impact upon his media-related thoughts in different ways? Well, the answer to that is neither, because McLuhan converted to Catholicism at the age of 26. There could not be a greater chasm between these denominations. McLuhan was influenced by the English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was also a Jesuit priest. Jesuits practiced mysticism, and it appears it was mysticism that drew McLuhan to Catholicism. Unlike Catholicism, Baptists, Methodists, and other forms of Protestantism have no place for confession. Their belief in hard work, labour, is what is known as the work ethic, which is born out of the idea along with living a frugal life may result in achieving salvation through God's love. But because God moves in mysterious ways, achieving salvation for the individual is never assured. Protestantism is a very rigid religion. Interestingly, Gerard Manley Hopkins had himself converted to Catholicism after being born into the Anglican Church. Also of interest was that McLuhan was fascinated by the type of syntax employed by Hopkins in his poetry. He claimed it transcended orthodox English, But did McLuhan know why? Hopkins had been influenced by the Welsh language when he studied at St. Bueno's Jesuit Spirituality Centre in St. Asaph, Wales. One influence was the cynhanaeth, meaning harmony, which places emphasis on repeating sounds. This type of creative writing had an enormous impact on McLuhan because for him it represented freedom. This colourful, creative style must have contrasted with the dour context of Protestantism. In the passage I read from the chapter written by Joost van Loon, he said that McLuhan was less interested in media representation, focusing his analysis of understanding technology, particularly in the way technology impacts upon the relationship between humans and their environment. Interestingly, McLuhan took this position as a criticism against the Catholic Church's use of technology. He argued that the Church had no idea or understanding of how communication technology would affect human relationships, on which he applied this view universally. Whilst his conversion to Catholicism impacted him personally, the question is this: did it impact upon his intellectual writings on media? That's a difficult question to answer in full without further investigation, but we do know the one writer who influenced McLuhan more than anybody else in relation to his media theory, which was Harold Innis, his fellow Canadian. In episode 9, I discussed Robert Babe's and James Winter's contribution concerning Harold Innis's theory of bias in relation to Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model. In Joost van Loon's chapter, he reflects on bias in relation to McLuhan's media theory. Allow me to read a passage from 162 which demonstrates this point. Before we are able to explore the impact of McLuhan on media theory, it is prudent to first stand still and reflect on the one theorist who had inspired him more than any other, Harold Innis. Innis's standing as a communication and media theorist has always been somewhat controversial because his primary background was political economy and history, in particular concerning the Canadian frontier economy. Within communication studies, the concept for which he was most famous is that of bias. Innis, as previously stated, was influenced by political economy and therefore was embedded within the materialist approach to development. But Joost van Loon, with reference to Coma, takes this a step further. Coma had argued that the approach by Innis was a form of dialectical materialism, and here is what Joost van Loon says on page 163. For Innis, the development of communications and media was often influenced by the need to address specific problems, conflicts, and imbalances produced by the existing constellation of media, which themselves are, of course, structurally embedded in relation to economic, political, social, cultural, and technological forces. Hence, Coma is quite right to suggest that Innis's work is a form of dialectical materialism. Central to Innis's dialectical approach was the way in which our mode of production, or bias, is itself situated between, on the one hand, a natural environment in which it is embedded, and on the other hand, a constellation of media, oriented towards the control of knowledge, wealth, and force, which it in turn embeds. The consequence of taking this approach is that we are no longer able to give primacy to either environment, mode of production, or media technologies to explain and understand social change. We are always forced to approach each of these three layers with the other two in mind. Now, the author goes on to explain how Innis adopted this dialectical approach to media communications research in a little bit more detail. And he explains that although McLuhan was greatly influenced by Innis's dialectical approach, he departed from the political economy model of media communication research. Once again, here is Joost van Loon on pages 163 and 164. Whilst following the basic premises of the Innisian mode of analysing media technological evolutions through a dialectical approach, McLuhan was much less keen on providing a political economic account as the foundation from which to explain the logic of historical change. In contrast, McLuhan radicalized Innis's understanding of bias by arguing that it is more closely connected to the nature of human being as a living, thinking creature whose motivations and desires are endlessly diverse and never reducible to the accumulation of either wealth, knowledge, or force. That is to say, whereas he kept the analytical method of dialectical materialism, he connected this to a more vitalistic and one might say Nietzschean ethos rather than a Marxist one. For a McLuhanist reading of Innis, bias of communication would not be primarily political phenomenon, but one that encompasses the whole of the human condition. That passage I just read was under the title of McLuhan's tetrad. Now, I don't want to go into detail here of the tetrad that McLuhan advocated for media communications research, but briefly, it is a four-category model used as a mode of analysis towards different types of media. The four categories are enhance, obsolescence, retrieves, and reverses, and at the centre of the tetrad is medium. So the four questions that they were to ask in terms of the mode of analysis of the media, there are four questions here. What does the medium enhance? What does the medium make obsolete? What does the medium retrieve that had been obsolesced earlier? And finally, what does the medium reverse or flip into when pushed to extremes? Now, the important point to understand here is that the same questions are asked in relation to different types of media in order to create a consistent mode of analysis to understand media effects on society. And here is what Joost van Loon says in relation to the radical nature of the tetrad on page 165. The question for this chapter is whether the tetrad has the potential to facilitate a radical media critique. That is to say, whether it is capable of contributing towards the development of a critical purchase that affects the basic principles of mediation itself. The answer which I will be seeking to develop is an unapologetic yes, because it cuts into the very essence of mediation. It explores its limits and exposes its transgressions. And the author goes on to say, this may sound a little odd, especially to those who generally associate radical critique with a critique of ideology, because McLuhan's tetrad is certainly not intended to facilitate an ideological critique in the traditional sense of the word. Indeed, whereas most media theory is merely a substratum of political theory, McLuhan's certainly is not. His writings have never been explicitly concerned with issues related to political ideologies. Instead, he preferred to comment on the communication style of politicians and how they were better or worse adapted to particular media types. Now, the author goes on to say that, like Innis, Marshall McLuhan's approach to media research was more radical than the offerings within a Marxist tradition, or indeed that forwarded by the Frankfurt School, which is certainly a point worthy of further investigation. McLuhan is known for his aphorism, which is the medium is the message. This is, in fact, the title of Chapter 1 in his 1964 book, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. McLuhan's primary interest was the technology in which messages were sent. This was an extremely controversial point, and one that departs from those who prioritise the linguistic message, media effects, where discourse is prioritised over the means of communication, television or radio, for instance. Much later, Neil Postman wrote his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, published 21 years later in 1985. Rather than using the term medium is the message, Postman's first chapter is titled The Medium is the Metaphor. Postman differentiated between language cultures, so for instance oral culture is seen differently from television viewing. The two, he argues, offer different kinds of knowledge, but television, he claimed, only required passive viewing. Literature for Postman was also different from the passive engagement of television. He also claimed that communication networks such as the Internet were displacing social contexts because of the space of which Internet communication takes place. I disagree with Postman's passive involvement with television. One clear example of that in the United Kingdom was ITV's drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. This was shown in 2024, and it has had a profound impact on public consciousness and the political sphere within the UK. Indeed, Tim Adams, writing in The Guardian in 2024, said, "Despite a 2-year inquiry and years of campaigning, it was the 4-hour drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office that enabled the British public to pay proper attention to the unbelievable horrors of this story." Adams then quite rightly lists other examples of great political drama, such as Ken Loach's drama produced in the 1960s called Cathy Come Home and Jimmy McGovern's Hillsborough. The former had and still has a huge impact on exposing the effects of homelessness resulting in mental health issues. The latter brought our attention of viewers to the horrors of a football match where 96 Liverpool supporters died due to negligence. Postman was driven to write his book based on a comparison between George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. This in itself is fascinating, but Postman sides too enthusiastically with Huxley, citing that watching television was akin to drug-taking. Huxley's word soma was a drug that became the opiate of the people, suppressing natural instincts by means of television. But all this negates social realism in television drama, which reflects the real lives of many viewers. I've explained the first part of McLuhan's book titled Understanding Media, which was used in his criticism of the Catholic Church's failure to fully understand the consequences of media technology. So what of the second part, the extensions of man? Firstly, this was McLuhan rejecting the idea at the time that new technology were mere instruments or tools whose function was to mediate non-ideological forms of expression. Therefore, he rejected instrumentalist and functionalist theories of technology. For McLuhan, there was no separation between a technological tool and a human being. There was no detachment between the agency and the means of communication. The idea that technology and media merely function for the benefits of humanity was and is a fallacy. Media has no objective basis, but rather is a means of expressing ideas. But it isn't Marxist in the sense that ideas are controlled by the dominant classes. McLuhan's analysis of media technologies allowed for other voices to be heard, and in this way technology wasn't also subservient to capital. As Joost van Loon says on page 168, McLuhan's approach, and I quote, enables a far more critical understanding of the technological underpinnings of social change. And this is what McLuhan meant by extensions of man, a means to communicate ideas but not necessarily beholden to dominant ideology. As Joost van Loon says, McLuhan was allowing for voices of resistance, which at the time reflected the class struggle. But how does all this fit into McLuhan's claim of a global village, being created as a result of increasing communication networks? Firstly, the interconnectedness of the world meant that both time and space had shrunk. Information travelled faster through communication networks, and whilst physical geographical space remained intact, it nevertheless abstracted itself into a metaphysical form. Reality would never seem the same again. Perceptions of space permanently altered because time had bent and warped it. This is simply based on technology being neutral. But secondly, the global village at the time was a contentious idea in terms of the flow of ideas between various points of communication. McLuhan was writing during the Cold War, but as time moved on, we can see that Western capitalism and its media therein completely dominated the landscape. The net result being the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1989. Fukuyama called it the end of history, and George Bush Sr. declared a New World Order had begun. The incorporation into the New World Order of both Russia and more significantly China meant that capitalism as the mode of production had gone beyond consolidation into a massive expansion. When the International Monetary Fund speaks of the global village in glowing terms, you know that the capitalist mode of production has arrived on a very large scale. In 1999, Stanley Fischer made a speech to the International Monetary Fund titled Global Markets and the Global Village in the 21st Century. Are international organizations prepared for the challenge? Stanley Fischer was the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund from September 1994 to August 2001. After referencing McLuhan, Fischer said, globalization is not only the internet and telecommunications, it is also the more traditional fare of economists, trade in goods and trade in assets. The theoretical case for free trade is that it permits countries to concentrate on activities in which they enjoy comparative advantage and subjects firms to the healthy discipline of foreign competition. It is this system of economics that Donald Trump is trying to tear up, but not succeed in, it would appear, which tells us that globalization in economic and communicative networks is deeply embedded in capitalist processes, something not even Trump will defeat. Perhaps it is fitting to end by referring once again to McLuhan's Catholic beliefs. As detailed in Nick Ripatrazzoni's wonderfully engaging book titled Digital Communion, Marshall McLuhan's Spiritual Vision for a Virtual Age, McLuhan's concern was that secularism would dominate the airways and use it for power over the minds of men. He strongly believed the Catholic Church should learn to embrace media and offer an alternative narrative to the secular one. In the 1960s, John Lennon said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, and this is exactly that level of consumerism that McLuhan feared most. McLuhan died in 1980, 9 years before the collapse of the Soviet system, and way before the advances in media technology we see today, such as the Internet. When the Internet and social media really took off, many writers and activists saw an opportunity to freely express ideas not subservient to capital. But who would have foreseen that the richest man in the world, controls X, formerly Twitter, to vent his extreme right-wing views and who happens to be a member of Donald Trump's government in 2025 and is a prophet of high-tech consumerism, the type of consumerism which McLuhan detested. In the next episode, I will be discussing the works of two Latin American writers. They are Jesus Martin Barbero and Nestor Garcia Canclini. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.